Welcome back to Shattered Trust Stories. The evening had arrived with all the grandeur one would expect from a gathering of this caliber. Outside, the mansion's imposing silhouette loomed against the darkening sky, its windows glowing warm, like jewels strewn across the landscape. The sprawling estate was surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and towering hedges that whispered with the evening breeze. The soft hum of crickets could barely be heard beneath the roar of luxury vehicles pulling up to the front door. Guests in tuxedos and silk gowns stepped out, eager to display their wealth, their status, and their influence to the world. Inside, the mansion pulsed with life, a cacophony of high society chatter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the faintest sound of fine china brushing against delicate linens for the guests inside. It was more than just a dinner. It was a performance. Robert Kavanaugh, the host of the evening, stood near the entrance, a towering figure of success and charisma. His deep voice carried across the room as he welcomed his guests with practiced ease. Robert was a man who had built an empire from the ground up, self-made, wealthy beyond measure, and fully aware of the power he wielded in social circles. He was the sort of man whose name was recognized in every boardroom, whose opinions shaped policies, and whose wealth seemed limitless. "Good evening, everyone." Robert's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, drawing the attention of all who were within earshot. "I hope you're all enjoying the evening. It's a pleasure to have you here." The guests nodded, murmuring their pleasantries, but Robert's words were just a formality. Tonight, the only thing that mattered was the show. The carefully curated attendees, the exquisite food, the glimmer of champagne bubbles rising in crystal glasses. No one had come here for genuine connection. They had come to be seen, to remind everyone else that they belonged at the top, the very top. And yet, amidst the sea of wealth and privilege, there was a woman whose name no one knew. Olivia Marks. She stood at the back of the room, awkward and uncomfortable, her delicate fingers grasping the stem of a champagne flute, but her eyes darting nervously between the guests. She wasn't part of their world, not in the way they were used to. She wasn't dressed in the boldest of gowns, nor did she possess the confidence of the socialites around her. Olivia wore a dress that, though beautiful, was understated. The soft blush pink fabric clung to her form in the most elegant way, but it lacked the opulence that would have matched the grandeur of the setting. Her makeup was minimal, and her hair was swept up into a neat updo, but there was no veil of perfection about her, no polished edge that screamed, "I belong here," and no one in the room had any idea who Olivia was, nor did they particularly care to know. She wasn't a person to them. She was an afterthought, a shadow at a dinner table of brightly lit stars. Olivia had come because she had to. The invitation had been a mere formality, something to fill the seat of a last-minute cancellation, a slot that Robert Kavanaugh hadn't cared enough about to fill with anyone of worth. And yet, here she was, standing among people who could easily dismiss her with a single glance. But Olivia wasn't the type to shrink. She had learned a long time ago that the world didn't make space for people like her. If she wanted to survive in it, she'd have to carve out her own space. Whether anyone noticed or not, as she adjusted her dress, trying to subtly pull it down to sit more comfortably against her hips, her eyes scanned the room. She had done her best to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to herself. But it was impossible not to feel the weight of the stares, the subtle, yet constant scrutiny. A few of the guests had already turned their heads to glance in her direction. Their eyes were sharp, assessing. There was an almost palpable air of disapproval in their gaze, though none of them spoke aloud. It was all there in the way they looked at her, like an insect under a magnifying glass. Small, insignificant, not belonging. One particular pair of eyes that lingered belonged to Karen, a woman of exceptional wealth and an insatiable desire to always be the center of attention. She was dressed in a fiery red silk gown that clung to her every curve, a striking contrast to Olivia's understated elegance. Her lips curled in a smile that barely touched her eyes as she leaned toward her husband, Richard, who was seated beside her, and whispered something Olivia could not quite hear, though the tone of Karen's voice was unmistakable, loud enough to be overheard by anyone within earshot. "Who is that? She doesn't belong here. I mean, just look at her. She looks like she's been plucked off the street and dropped into the middle of this event. How did she even get an invitation?" Richard, who was more interested in the fine glass of whiskey he was holding than his wife's observation, raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. His expression was amused, but there was a trace of something darker in his eyes, a judgment that matched Karen's. Probably some assistant or intern trying to worm her way into the inner circle. You know how it goes. His voice was low, but sharp that Olivia's heart sank. She could feel her cheeks growing warm with a familiar mixture of embarrassment and anger. She wasn't here by accident. She hadn't wormed her way in or earned a spot through some convoluted means. She had simply been invited. A last-minute invitation, yes, but still an invitation. Yet in a room full of people who saw the world through the lens of power and influence, Olivia didn't fit. She wasn't the right kind of person, not the right class, not the right background, not the right anything. Her grip on the champagne flute tightened, her knuckles turning white. She felt her anxiety rise, and for a moment, she considered leaving. She wasn't sure what she had expected from this evening. Perhaps an opportunity to glimpse the world she'd always dreamed of, or maybe to prove to herself that she could belong among these people. But it was clear now that none of that would happen. She wasn't made for this world. She didn't belong. Just as she was about to turn away, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice was soft but firm. Olivia turned toward the man who had spoken, a tall figure in a well-tailored suit. His face was calm, almost too calm, and there was something about his smile, polite but with an undertone of condescension, that immediately put Olivia on edge. "Are you here as an assistant or something?" he asked, his gaze scanning her from head to toe. The words felt like a jab, the tone casual, but there was no mistaking the implication. Olivia hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, the sting of humiliation already beginning to settle in. But she took a deep breath, forcing her composure back into place. "Actually, I'm here as a guest." Her voice was steady, though there was a slight falter as she tried to hold her ground. The man chuckled softly, a small, dismissive sound. "A guest? How interesting. I didn't realize Robert's guest list was so inclusive." Olivia felt a flush of anger rise in her chest, but she didn't respond. She simply forced another tight smile and turned away, pretending that the sting of his words didn't bother her. She was used to it. She'd been used to it her whole life, being dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. She could feel their eyes on her, but she wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. She would stand tall, even if it felt like the weight of the world was pushing down on her shoulders. She made her way to the table, where she could find some semblance of quiet. The conversations around her had shifted, but the whispers still clung to the air. They weren't talking about her, but they didn't need to. She could feel it, the judgment, the coolness. They were all looking at her, but none of them saw her. Not really. Not as a person. As she sat down, she tried to settle into her chair. She placed her glass of champagne down, untouched. The room continued to swirl around her, a sea of laughter, chatter, and clinking silverware. She was invisible. Not a single person approached her. The host, Robert, offered her a brief glance across the room, but his attention was quickly diverted by someone else. And so she sat, alone, an outsider in a room full of people who could never understand what it felt like to be in her shoes. But Olivia was stronger than they gave her credit for, stronger than they could ever imagine. And as the evening wore on, she knew something they didn't. She didn't need their approval to be someone important. She just needed to hold on long enough to prove them wrong. The evening dragged on, each moment stretching endlessly in a room that seemed to pulse with superficiality and judgment. Olivia had long since stopped trying to blend in, settling into the uncomfortable quiet that had enveloped her. Every glance, every whisper felt like a weight on her shoulders, and though she tried to remain composed, there was no escaping the suffocating awareness that no one saw her as anything other than an outsider. She sat there, her glass untouched, her mind elsewhere, until the soft hum of conversation began to quiet down. The change in the atmosphere was subtle at first, the murmur of voices shifting into a more purposeful hush. Olivia noticed it in the way the guests adjusted themselves in their seats, straightening their backs and subtly pulling at their clothes as if preparing themselves for something or someone important. The energy in the room was palpable, like a collective breath held in anticipation to a tea first. Olivia wasn't sure what was happening. She stole a quick glance around, looking for the source of the change. Her eyes flitted across the room, passing over the guests who had once barely spared her a glance. But now they were all looking toward the entrance with rapt attention. There was no mistaking it. Someone, had just entered the room. The heavy wooden doors, adorned with gold accents, creaked open slowly. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, resonating throughout the quiet space. For a brief, electrifying moment, time seemed to pause. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, her eyes instinctively shifting toward the entrance, even though she had no idea why. And then he stepped into the room. That he was tall, impossibly tall, with an air of quiet confidence that filled the entire space. He moved with the grace of someone who had mastered the art of commanding attention without needing to announce it. His suit was dark, the fabric rich and immaculate, and the cut was so precise it seemed to have been tailored just for him. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as though he had just run his hands through it. His jawline was sharp, chiseled, and beneath the subtle stubble, his face held an expression of effortless superiority. But it was his eyes, those eyes, that drew everyone in. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine as her gaze locked with his for the briefest moment. His eyes were dark, deep, and almost impossibly intense, as if they could see through her, past her, and into her soul. For a second, she felt as though the entire room had vanished. It was just him and her. No one else mattered. But before she could even process what had just happened, the murmur of the crowd resumed, and Olivia snapped back to reality. The guests, all of them, seemed to exhale in unison. It was as though they had been holding their breath in anticipation of his arrival, that he wasn't just anyone. This man was someone important. Nick, Robert Kavanaugh's voice rang out, a note of genuine warmth and reverence in his greeting. The billionaire host crossed the room with a speed that suggested he had been expecting this moment. He extended a hand, his grin wide. "I'm glad you could join us. Everyone has been eager to meet you." The man, Nick or Nicholas, Olivia soon learned, smiled in return, but it was a smile that barely touched his lips. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough to make people lean in, to make the air shift. He shook Robert's hand with a firm, almost possessive grip, and the two exchanged a few words in hushed tones. The conversation no doubt business, but it wasn't the business that caught Olivia's attention. It was the way he moved, the ease with which he navigated the room, as if he were the natural center of it all. The way everyone gravitated toward him, as though he were a magnet, pulling them closer with just the force of his being. Olivia watched from her seat, captivated by the way he carried himself. She had never met anyone like him. There was something almost otherworldly about him, something that made the rest of the room feel like a backdrop to his presence. As the evening wore on, Olivia couldn't help but notice the way people began to behave around him. The men, who had previously been preoccupied with their own conversations and egos, now leaned in with apparent interest as he spoke. The women, Karen included, watched him with a kind of rapt fascination, their gazes lingering just a moment too long. It was clear that Nicholas was not just wealthy. He was someone who commanded the kind of attention most people only dreamed of. And then, as if on cue, he looked up. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of his guests. But then, as if drawn by an invisible force, his eyes landed on Olivia. For the briefest moment, everything else seemed to fade away. Olivia's pulse quickened, and her breath hitched in her chest. She felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if she had known him forever. Even though they had never exchanged a word, that it wasn't a look of simple curiosity or acknowledgement. It was something more intense, almost as though he were seeing her for the first time, but also as though he knew her, understood her, in a way that no one else ever had. Her heart thudded in her chest. She didn't know why, but she felt an inexplicable connection to him, a pull she couldn't explain. She was aware of the other guests around her, aware of their conversations and their judgment, but none of it mattered now. All that mattered was the way he was looking at her. Nicholas smiled. It was brief, but it was enough. The smile reached his eyes, and for a moment, it was just them. His gaze was sharp, calculating, but there was a hint of something else in it. Something that made Olivia's stomach flip. She had never been the object of such attention, not like this. Then he moved. He didn't walk toward her immediately, but she could feel him closing the distance, each step deliberate, purposeful. The guests around him parted like the Red Sea, making way for him to move freely through the room, as though they were simply aware that he commanded that space. When he finally stood before her, Olivia felt a strange heat crawl up her neck. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to come directly to her. "Olivia," Nicholas said, his voice low and smooth, sending a shiver down her spine. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and it was more than just the words themselves. It was the tone, the confidence, the almost magnetic power behind it. His voice felt like it was designed to draw people in, to make them listen. And for some reason, she found herself leaning in, as if she too were powerless to resist. She forced herself to smile, though she was sure it was a little too tight. "Hello," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. But he didn't respond with anything as simple as a polite greeting. Instead, he took the seat next to her without asking, like it was his by right. There was no pretense, no small talk, just the raw, commanding energy that emanated from him. Olivia felt the eyes of the entire room on her, and for the first time that evening, she didn't feel so alone. "I've been meaning to meet you, Olivia," he said, leaning just a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Her brow furrowed slightly. "You have." He smiled again, but this time it was different, knowing, assured. "Yes, from Robert. He's spoken highly of you." Olivia wasn't sure what to make of that. Robert had hardly noticed her presence all evening, so to think he'd spoken of her in any way, much less in a positive light, was strange. But she said nothing, unsure of what kind of game Nicholas was playing. "What brings you here?" she asked, unsure of how else to respond. The words felt like they slipped out on their own, a poor attempt at small talk, but it was the best she could manage. Nicholas seemed to savor the question. He took a moment before answering, studying her face as though he were searching for something hidden there. "I could ask you the same thing," he said softly. "You're not like the others in this room, are you?" Her heart raced at the implication. "I'm just here as a guest," she replied quickly, though she couldn't help but feel a pang of insecurity. Did he think she didn't belong here? Was he about to dismiss her like everyone else had? He shook his head, his lips curling into a slight, enigmatic smile. "I don't think you're just a guest, Olivia. And I don't think you're here by accident either." His words sent a shiver through her, an electric feeling of anticipation building in the air between them. There was something more to him. The evening continued to unfold like a carefully choreographed dance. But now, as Nicholas sat beside Olivia, the dynamics of the room seemed to shift even further. The conversations around them fell into a hushed, almost reverent silence, as though the entire party had suddenly become aware of their interaction. No longer was Olivia the invisible woman, the outsider. She was now at the center of something far more significant than she could have imagined. Nicholas, it seemed, had decided that she was worth his time, and that made her a person of interest to everyone else in the room. People were watching, not just from the corners of their eyes, but openly now, as if waiting for the next move in this silent game of social chess. "Tell me, Olivia," Nicholas said, his voice smooth and unhurried. Do you believe in fate? He leaned slightly closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Olivia blinked, taken aback by the unexpected question. She wasn't prepared for this level of directness. Fate, she repeated, as if testing the word. Her pulse quickened in response, though she tried to keep her composure. The chill of his presence seemed to envelope her, and she suddenly realized how dangerous this situation was. It wasn't just a dinner anymore. Something was happening here, something that she couldn't quite grasp, that Nicholas's lips curled into the slightest of smiles, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that Olivia couldn't ignore. Fate, he echoed. It's an interesting concept. Most people believe they control their lives, their choices. But sometimes life is a way of pushing us toward the inevitable. Don't you think? His words hung in the air like smoke, drifting into Olivia's mind. She wasn't sure what he meant, but something in her gut told her that this was no ordinary conversation. There was more beneath the surface. There was a reason he was here, sitting beside her, speaking to her with such intensity. This wasn't a chance encounter. She hesitated, unsure how to respond. Her eyes flicked toward the other guests, who were still watching, but no one seemed to be daring to approach. They were waiting for something to happen, as if they were all somehow connected to this moment, to this conversation. Olivia felt the weight of their gazes on her, but for the first time that evening, she wasn't bothered by it. The rest of the room was simply a blur, fading into the background as she focused on Nicholas. I don't know about fate, she said slowly, her voice steady, but her mind racing. But I do know that life has a way of surprising us. She couldn't help but wonder if this was one of those moments that Nicholas's gaze softened, though the intensity never left his eyes. Surprise. Yes, that's the perfect word for it. He smiled again, and this time, the smile reached his eyes, a flicker of something dark and knowing. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? Before Olivia could reply, there was a sudden change in the atmosphere, a shift that rippled across the room. The guests had begun to murmur among themselves again, but this time, the whispers weren't just idle gossip. The tension in the air had thickened, and someone was coming. Nicholas didn't flinch. His composure remained immaculate, as though he had expected this moment to arrive. Olivia glanced around, trying to make sense of the change, but it wasn't until the doors to the dining hall opened once more that she understood. Robert Kavanaugh, the host of the evening, had returned, but he wasn't alone. His arrival had been dramatic enough on its own, but the person standing beside him now was what drew all eyes to them. A man, sharply dressed in a crisp suit, his face hidden beneath dark sunglasses, entered the room with a presence that made even Robert look small in comparison. The crowd parted again, but this time, there was no murmur of surprise or confusion. No, the guests were all too aware of who this man was. It was the way they looked at him, the way they moved aside as if to give him space. They knew exactly who he was, and they were not eager to test his patience, that Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this man before, but there was no mistaking the look of admiration mixed with fear in the eyes of the people in the room. This was not just another wealthy guest. This was someone whose reputation preceded him, someone whose presence alone made the atmosphere crackle with tension. Nicholas leaned in, his lips barely brushing Olivia's ear as he whispered, "Watch closely." Before Olivia could ask what he meant, the man approached Nicholas, his expression cold and unreadable behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses. The two men exchanged a brief, intense look, but there was no handshake, no pleasantries. It was a silent exchange, one that spoke volumes. "Robert," the man said, his voice like gravel, gruff and authoritative. It was a voice that demanded respect, the kind of voice that made people listen, whether they wanted to or not. "Yes, Jack?" Robert responded, his tone wavering ever so slightly. There was an undercurrent of fear in Robert's voice, but it was subtle, something only those who had been around power long enough could detect. "I've heard the whispers," the man, Jack said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Olivia. His eyes were sharp, calculating. I'm here for more than just the wine and company tonight." A murmur ran through the room, and Olivia could feel her heart skip a beat. This wasn't just an ordinary social event. There was a deeper game being played here, and she was beginning to realize that she was standing right in the middle of it. Nicholas, who had remained entirely composed, stood up, breaking the silence. His presence seemed to command the room even more powerfully than Jack's, and when he spoke, it was with a cool, confident authority. "Jack, I'm glad you made it. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." There was a slight pause. The weight of their exchange wasn't lost on anyone. Robert stood silently between the two men, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events, but unwilling to intervene. "You're sure you want to do this?" Jack's voice was low, almost a growl, as he finally removed his sunglasses, revealing a pair of sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to be able to see through everything. That Nicholas's smile was nothing short of chilling. "I've waited long enough. This is the moment." The room fell silent again. Even the whispers had stopped. Everyone could sense that something momentous was about to happen. The air was thick with tension, and Olivia could feel herself drawn into the vortex of it all. She didn't understand the full picture yet, but she could feel the shift in the room. Something was about to unfold. Something that would change everything. Jack's gaze turned to Olivia again. And for the first time, Olivia felt a sense of fear, a ripple of unease. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her wonder if this whole evening had been more than just coincidence. Had she been a pawn all along? Nicholas's eyes remained locked on hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw something like amusement flicker in his gaze. But it wasn't the amusement of a man enjoying the company of a woman. No, this was different. This was the amusement of someone who knew exactly how the story would unfold, and was waiting for the perfect moment to let it all come crashing down. "We're done here," Jack said suddenly, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence. "Let's finish what we started." And just like that, the facade of civility shattered. Nicholas moved first, his steps purposeful, his hand reaching out for Olivia's. She didn't have time to react, to understand. All she knew was that in that moment, everything in her life had just shifted. There was no going back. The air in the room hung heavy, as if it had been poisoned, and Olivia could feel her pulse thundering in her ears. She had been a part of something far larger than she had realized, a web of deceit and manipulation that had been spun around her without her even noticing. The events that had unfolded in the last few moments had left her breathless and shaken. But there was no time to process. The storm had come, and now she was in its Nicholas's hand, warm and firm, wrapped around hers. She didn't resist as he guided her forward, through the throngs of people who were still frozen in place, unsure of what had just happened. The entire dinner party had come to an abrupt halt. Conversations had ceased, but it wasn't an awkward silence. No, this was a silence pregnant with tension, thick with anticipation. The guests weren't sure whether to applaud, flee, or pretend they hadn't just witnessed something pivotal. Olivia was acutely aware of every single pair of eyes on her, but she wasn't the one who commanded the attention now. Nicholas had become the center of everything. With one small, decisive move, he had rewritten the rules of the game. The moment she looked up at him, she saw the subtle glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He didn't speak, but there was something in his expression that told her everything she needed to know. He had orchestrated this. This was his plan, and they had just crossed the threshold into the final act. Her thoughts were racing as they exited the hall. The noise from the guests faded behind them, but the sharpness of the situation followed her like a shadow. She didn't understand at all how everything had come to this, but she knew she was a part of it now. Nicholas led her down a long corridor, away from the clamor of the main event. The quiet of the hallway only heightened her confusion. Her heart was still hammering in her chest, but she couldn't help the unease that crawled up her spine. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice shaky, her thoughts jumbled. "You'll see soon enough," Nicholas replied, his tone calm, but there was an edge to it. It was a promise, a dark, inevitable promise. His grip on her hand tightened. just enough for her to feel the strength behind it. It wasn't an aggressive hold, but a subtle way of showing her that she wasn't going anywhere. When they reached the end of the hallway, Nicholas stopped, turning to face her. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to blur, and it was just the two of them standing in this quiet, isolated space. He didn't speak immediately, and neither did Olivia. The weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on her, but she had no choice but to wait for him to explain. Then, finally, his lips curled into that same enigmatic smile, the one she had seen earlier. "You were wondering why you're here, Olivia. Why I pulled you into all of this," he said, his voice low but clear. "You've been playing a part in a much bigger picture than you realized." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She had been so sure she had understood her role in this evening, an awkward guest trying to fit in, trying to survive. But this was something else entirely. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle start to click into place, but they didn't form the picture she had expected. "The truth is, you weren't just a pawn in my plan," Nicholas continued, his eyes dark and intense. "You were the key." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The key? To what? She felt a dizzying mix of confusion and panic. Her hand still caught in his now felt heavy. Her thoughts swirled. She wasn't just a part of the plot. She was at its core. Before she could respond, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "Everything that's been happening in that room, the tension, the whispers, the power dynamics, it's all been building up to this moment. And you're right here at the center of it, Olivia." She stared at him, her heart still racing, but with a growing understanding. "What are you talking about?" "I needed the right person to bring everything together," Nicholas said, stepping closer. "Someone who could walk into that room and turn the tide, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by the power players who've been running the show for far too long. You've been underestimated your entire life. You've always been seen as the outsider, the burden, the one who doesn't belong. And that," he said with a cold smile, "was exactly what I needed." Olivia's head was spinning. She couldn't comprehend it. This whole evening, she had felt like she was sinking into quicksand, surrounded by people who pitted her, whispered about her behind her back, and looked down on her. She had thought she was invisible, powerless, someone who simply had to endure the barbs of others. But now, Nicholas was telling her something completely different. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why me of all people?" Nicholas's gaze softened, though his expression remained unreadable. "Because you're stronger than they think. You've always been stronger than they think." It wasn't what she had expected. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment. There was respect. "I've been watching you for a while now, Olivia," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "And I knew you had something inside of you. Something that could turn everything around." Olivia's chest tightened as the pieces began to fit. Nicholas had been watching her. Not just tonight, but for longer. He had known exactly who she was, what she was capable of, and he had pulled her into this game, this web of manipulation, for a reason. And now, it's time to make them see you for who you really are. Before she could ask another question, the door at the end of the hallway opened with a soft click. The low murmur of voices reached them, a stark contrast to the silent tension that had surrounded them moments before. Nicholas's expression shifted again, becoming colder, sharper. He turned toward the door, his grip on Olivia's hand still steady, but now with a purpose. "It's time," he said simply. As they entered the next room, the atmosphere shifted once again. The power players were still there, Robert, Karen, and all the others who had been part of this charade. But there was something different in their eyes now. They had been on the cusp of something. A revelation, perhaps. And that's when it hit them. The table had turned. They didn't know it yet, but they were already trapped in the web that Nicholas had so carefully woven. Olivia had been the catalyst for this moment, the spark that would set everything alight. As Nicholas stood tall, his presence dominating the room, it became clear justice would be served, not with loud explosions or heated confrontations, but with a quiet, devastating certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nicholas began, his voice ringing out, cutting through the silence of the room. "This evening, You've all been part of something far bigger than you could have imagined. But it's time to face the truth. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Robert, his face flushed with confusion, opened his mouth to speak, but Nicholas raised a hand, silencing him. Let me remind you all, Nicholas continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, that everything you've done, everything you've whispered behind closed doors, every false judgment, and every backhanded comment, it's all been observed. And now the consequences are here. Olivia stood beside him, her head held high. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that dinner hours ago, uncertain and invisible. She was someone different now, someone empowered. The tables had turned, and she wasn't going to let them forget it. Nicholas stepped forward, and the room held its breath. The people you've trampled, the people you've underestimated, they're done being your targets. And as for Olivia, he said, turning to her with a meaningful glance, she's no longer the burden you thought she was. She's the one you'll answer to. The silence that followed was deafening. The guests had no idea how to respond. Some looked at each other in disbelief. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to acknowledge the severity of what was happening. But one thing was certain. The justice that had been so carefully crafted was now upon them, and it was far more painful than any of them had anticipated. As Olivia stood there, watching them, she knew it was over. The revenge had been swift, calculated, and absolute. Nicholas had used everything, his wealth, his connections, his power, but most of all, he had used her. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't the weak one. She had become the instrument of their reckoning. And in the end, the tables had turned. Justice had been served, not with rage or anger, but with the quiet satisfaction of a plan well executed. They had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price. The silence in the room was almost suffocating now, like a thick fog that made it difficult to breathe. Olivia stood there, steady but still processing the chain of events that had unraveled so quickly, so unexpectedly. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since Nicholas had made his declaration, since the moment everything had changed. It felt as if the world had shifted beneath her feet, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was sinking into it. She felt like she was standing tall, in control, looking down at those who had once looked at her with disdain, pity, and contempt. The guests were scattered around the room, some still frozen in disbelief, others slowly starting to gather their wits, but none of them dared to make a move. Robert, Karen, and the others who had been so smug just hours ago now looked like trapped animals, unable to escape the web that Nicholas had so expertly woven. Olivia could feel their gazes on her, but they no longer carried the same venom or judgment. There was no longer any sneering, no dismissive glances, only uncertainty and fear. Nicholas had made it clear. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated her. But what was more profound was the realization that, in this moment, Olivia had come full circle. From the woman they had called a burden, to the one who now held the power to make them question everything they had believed about themselves and the world around them. She wasn't just standing next to Nicholas. She was standing beside him as an equal, someone who had played a crucial role in the downfall of those who had sought to destroy her. The feeling of being seen, truly seen, was more overwhelming than anything she had ever experienced. For so long, she had been defined by the way others saw her. The quiet woman in the corner, the one whose presence was barely acknowledged, the one they took for granted. But now Olivia was no longer defined by their perceptions. She had stepped out of their shadow and into her own. She glanced at Nicholas, who was watching the room with a calm that bordered on disinterest. His cool demeanor had never wavered, even when the entire situation had been on the verge of exploding. But Olivia knew deep down, that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about something bigger, something more profound. Nicholas hadn't just taken down those who had wronged her. He had helped her see her own worth. He had given her a way to rise above the limitations that had been placed on her. Her thoughts flashed back to that moment at the beginning of the night when she had been unsure of her place at that dinner, when she had felt like an outsider, a mere observer. She had walked into that room as the burden they all had written off, and now she was walking out of it as someone who had turned the tables, someone who had flipped the narrative entirely. The guests were still reeling, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. But Olivia was no longer worried about them. She had done what she needed to do. They would have to face the consequences of their actions, the weight of their years of condescension, their whisper campaigns, their cruelty. They would have to reckon with the fact that the woman they had once dismissed had become their undoing. Nicholas turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then that small, knowing smile appeared again. "You did well," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Olivia nodded, though she didn't trust her voice enough to speak just yet. She was still processing, still letting the enormity of what had happened sink in. The words "you did well" felt like more than just praise. They felt like validation, like acknowledgement that she had finally taken control of her own narrative, that she was no longer a passive participant in the lives of others, but an active force in her own destiny. It wasn't just about the revenge, although that would be sweet. It wasn't even about the fact that she had helped bring down those who had wronged her, who had thought her insignificant. It was about her own transformation. The person she had been that evening, timid, unsure, overlooked, had been replaced with someone entirely different. Someone who knew her worth, who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself and others. She could already feel the shift within her, deep down. It wasn't a change that would fade with time. It was permanent. "I never thought," she started to say, but her voice trailed off. She wasn't sure what to finish that sentence with. She had never thought she'd be capable of something like this, of standing in the center of it all and watching as the world around her crumbled. Nicholas, always perceptive, seemed to understand what she was thinking. "You never thought you were strong enough," he said softly, finishing the thought for her. "But you were. You always were." She didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The truth of his words settled into her bones, a quiet affirmation of the person she was becoming. The dinner party, though still full of tension, would slowly begin to break apart. Conversations would be forced to shift, alliances would crumble, and reputations would be shattered. But in the midst of all that chaos, Olivia knew one thing for certain. She was no longer a bystander in her own life. She had become the protagonist of her own story. She stood there with Nicholas, the room full of people she had once thought would define her future. She realized something else, too. She had finally broken free from the chains of their judgment. The burdens they had placed on her, whether intentional or not, had been lifted. She was no longer carrying them. They would carry their own burdens now, consequences they couldn't escape. It was a strange sort of peace that settled in her heart, an unshakable calm that told her this was just the beginning. There would be no more hiding, no more shrinking away from what she deserved. She had proven her worth, not just to them, but to herself. Nicholas placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. He added, "This is just the start, Olivia. What's next is up to you." She turned her gaze back toward the guests, each one a part of the broken system that had tried to keep her down. She didn't need to say anything more. Her actions had spoken louder than words ever could. And in that moment, she understood that the most powerful revenge of all wasn't the destruction of her enemies. It was the creation of the woman she had always been meant to be. The one they could never have anticipated. The one who had come full circle. With a deep breath, Olivia smiled. And for the first time in a long time, she felt completely, unapologetically free.